Right, okay then. So we're going to look this morning at question 3, paper 1 for English language. As you can see, the question is always, how has the writer structured the whole text to interest the reader? And it's worth 8 marks. Can I ask you all, and I know that some of you are familiar with how to do this, can you just highlight some of the key things in the question that you need to pay attention to? So it shouldn't take you long. Okay, right. Who would like to tell me then what's important to focus on in the question? Kirsty?
Structure.
Okay, good. Right, so if you can all just highlight that word. The important thing to remember here is that structure is very different to language. In the past, pupils can get mixed up between language analysis and structural analysis. So we're going to make sure that you're all very aware of what structural features are. What else is important in that question, in that task? So what else have you highlighted? Callum? And 8 marks, yeah, good. Okay. Callum, just tell me really quickly then, how many minutes do you spend on this question? 10. Yeah, good. So both the language and the structure question on paper 1 you would spend 10 minutes on. Okay, there's something that I would say is equally as important as the word structured in that task that we've not yet highlighted. What might it be? Alicia? Okay, yeah, it is about the whole text. That's important because question 2, language, was about a specific extract. There's something else though really important. So important that I'm going to change the colour of my highlighter. Ricky?
Interest.
Bit more than that?
The reader.
Okay, good. So if you can just make sure that you've highlighted that part of the question. Some of you have heard me say this before, probably several times. It is the only question that you can be guaranteed you will be asked about the reader. Now, the irony of that is when pupils answer this question on the exam, it's the one question where they forget to mention the reader. So on question 2, language, lots of people will tell me about the effect of language features on the reader. But when they get to question 3, they forget to mention this phrase. So can I just ask you all now, can you just annotate there that that phrase needs to be mentioned frequently in your answer? So every comment you make, you should go back to, this would interest the reader because, or a phrase that means the same as that. So this would intrigue the reader because. One thing you should be careful never to say though is this makes the reader want to read on, because that's too general. You could say that about any text and any structural feature. So make sure you're using that phrase a lot in your answer. Okay, before we actually look then at what structural features are, can anyone tell me what the mark scheme is for this question? So we looked at the language mark scheme the other day. The language mark scheme had 3 bullet points. This one's also got 3 bullet points. Can anyone tell me what they are? Very similar to the language bullet points. There's just one slight difference. Jordan, can you tell me one maybe?
Quotation.
Right, good. So just put somewhere, maybe on the back of the sheet if you've got room, or on the lined paper, that the mark scheme for question 3, that's question 3, paper 1, you must use judicious quotations. It needs to be a range of quotations as well, so more than one. Again, people often forget to use quotations when they're talking about structure for some reason. So I'm going to show you how you can pick key quotations. What does judicious mean? Pardon, Alicia? You need a range. Judicious doesn't quite mean that.
Carefully selected.
Who said that? Kirsty. Yeah, carefully selected, well-chosen quotations that are relevant. Can anyone tell me what the second of the 3 bullet points is on the structure question? Good. Okay. So again, as we've just mentioned, it's effect on the reader or more specifically in this question, how the reader is interested. Okay? Now, I've had pupils ask me before, or say to me before, well, the text doesn't interest me. That's fair enough, okay, but you have to fake interest for the exam. So you have to come up with a range of comments as to why a reader might be interested. So writers want to make a reader have a reaction to the text. So that could be, a text could frustrate them, it could engage them, it could entertain them. So we're going to come up with a range of different comments to focus on the reader and how they're interested. What is the third bullet point? Very similar to the language bullet points.
Structural features.
Right, good. You said structural features. I'm just going to put this first. So exactly the same as language at the moment, you've got to use subject terminology. But the only thing is, the subject terminology for this question means your structural features. So if this were a language question, can anyone put up their hand and tell me some of the subject terminology you might use if it were a language question? Ricky?
Therefore, synonyms.
Metaphor, simile, good. What else if it were a language question? Semantic fields, good. So, however, we're not looking at language, we're looking at structure. So the next task that we need to do together now is actually work out what structural features are. Now, I find that when you teach pupils the structural features, in the order that you should talk about them, they understand it. But it's whether you know the structural features or not. So I'm going to delete that off the board now, and I'd like you to put another heading. So if you put structural features, now some of you might be more familiar with these than others. I'm going to put them in rank order, so the order of priority in which you should talk about them in the exam. So let's start off. Does anyone actually know any structural features, structural terminology? Ricky?
Paragraph length.
Right, okay. Paragraph lengths I'm going to put quite low down on my rank order because the exam boards say that, you know, it's not the strongest structural feature to talk about unless there's something significant to say about your paragraphing. So remember it and I'll put it lower down later on.
Changes in focus.
Excellent, okay. I'm going to put that as number 2. So my second bullet point is going to be, you said change of focus. Focus is one of the words you can use. What's the other word that they like you to use? Begins with a P.
Perspective.
Good, okay. So perspective shifts or focus shifts. Now, this is linked to paragraphing, but you should know from when you were at primary school that the reason that you change paragraphs is either because you're changing the speaker, the place, the idea, or the time. So, an easy way to look at how a text has been structured is to think about what changes between the paragraphs. So, is it the time? Is it the place? So, can I ask you just to put in brackets, perspective shifts will be things like time shifts, place shifts, and does anyone know what the exam board have particularly recommended that we look for perspective shift wise? What have they asked us to look for? Something to do with if I point at my head.
Flashbacks.
Pardon?
Flashbacks.
Flashbacks are, yeah, in there, so do look out for any kind of flashbacks, good.
Internal, external.
Excellent, okay, so they've asked us to guide pupils to look for where there is a shift from the internal thoughts of the narrator, of the protagonist in the extract, to external surroundings. Or vice versa, so it can be the other way around. So it can be external surroundings to internal thoughts. So there was a text on the exam one year where, or on one of the specimen papers, where it started off focusing on a boy waking up from a nightmare. So that focused on his internal thoughts. The second paragraph shifted perspective then onto the weather outside his window, which was very stormy. So you can see that there was a shift from internal thoughts to external surroundings. Okay? So perspective shifts are really important, and that is your structural terminology. So with your highlighter, you need to have those words in your answer somewhere. Maybe even some of these words, time, place shifts, etc. So this is your terminology. Does anyone know what should come first then? Good, yeah, okay. So openings or beginnings and endings. Now I know that's not particularly fancy terminology, but you do need to use those phrases in your answer because they are subject terms. Right, I'm going to give you a few tips then for the types of things you can talk about here. So, again, I know some of you have been to revision with me and some of you have done this recently in lesson. What should you always talk about when you look at the beginning of a text, the opening of a text? Jordan, can you remember? Because we did this on Friday, didn't we? What should you always talk about at the beginning of a text? What does a writer immediately do?
Mention someone.
Possibly. What else can they mention?
A place.
A place, good, okay. So can you remember the phrase that we start our answer with? The writer... Ladisha, can you remember?
The word immediately establishes.
Good, okay. So a bit of a top tip here. I'm going to write it up here. When you actually start your answer to this question, and I don't care what the text is, it can be applied to any text in the exam, you should start your answer with this phrase, and it will get you marks immediately. So if you start your answer by telling me what the writer immediately establishes at the beginning of the text, you will get marks. Now, you can't just leave it at that. What types of things does a writer immediately establish at the beginning of a story, of a narrative? So I open a book, on the first page, Jordan said a couple of them. What type of things might be established for a reader? What do I need to know as the reader at the beginning of a text? Right, what is it about? WH word, what? So what's the topic? What else might I need to know? Who is involved in the story? What else? WH word. Where? When, I heard somebody say. Any other WH words? Why? Okay, so if you become a journalist, for example, and you write newspaper articles, or if you become a police officer and you have to get people to write statements, or you have to write statements, the first thing you establish is some of the who, what, where, when, or why facts. A writer does the same thing. So, let's just put some of the things that would be established at the beginning would be who is involved, what is the story about, where is it taking place, when is it taking place, and why is it happening. Now, will a writer of a fiction text always go through all 5 of those at the beginning in the first sentence? No, okay? So you might be lucky to get 2 out of the 5. Now, why do you think a writer of a fiction text wouldn't include all of them? So in a police report, the writer might say, last night, which is when, in Birmingham, a young man took part in a robbery in an attempt to steal thousands of pounds. So in a police report you would expect all of those things to be covered immediately. However, a writer of fiction won't necessarily do that. They might tell you where it's taking place and who is involved. Why will they not tell you all of those things?
Because that's the whole point, so that it keeps them reading and then they find out stuff after.
Excellent, okay? So as a writer, they want you to continue to read the text and find out that information as you read. So it's almost like giving you a taster. It's keeping you in suspense. But whatever you do, start your answer with the writer immediately establishes at the beginning of the text who is involved and where the action is taking place. And then you would back that up with a quotation from the first sentence. That would get you, believe it or not, a couple of marks if you told me what the effect was on the reader. So that would be 2 marks out of 8 already. So please start your answer with that. Okay, let's think about endings now. I'll write this up here. What should you always look for? Because if you look at the first and the last sentence, what can you always look for with the ending of a text?
Is it circular narrative?
Right, okay. So is there any, and these again are all your structural terms that you need to talk about. What is circular narrative, Rakib?
The beginning and the ending are similar.
Good, okay. So are the beginning and the ending similar? Are they linked or connected in some way? Does something significant change, etc.? What else should you always look for at the end of a text in the last sentence? Structural term beginning with F. Foreshadowing, good, okay. So, can anybody give me a definition of what foreshadowing is? Alicia?
It's when you get a sense that something is about to happen.
Excellent, okay. So the writer will leave hints, won't they, in the last sentence of an extract or the last sentence of a chapter. They'll hint at things that are going to happen in the future. I always like to use the example of EastEnders. Yeah? EastEnders leaves you at the end of each episode on a cliffhanger. I've used this example before, Callum, but I'll use it again. So you tell me, at the end of, I don't know any of the characters in EastEnders. What's the woman that works in the pub called? Blonde hair.
Say Peggy, the old one.
Okay, let's say Peggy. Right.
The old one.
Let's imagine Peggy's married, and at the end of the episode she says, "My husband would never cheat on me." And then you get the music coming in. Immediately to the audience, what is being foreshadowed?
They think that name
He will. Good. So if you want to keep your viewers watching that programme, you know that it's being foreshadowed that Peggy's husband is going to have an affair. He's going to cheat on her. Okay, so the hints are left for the reader in the same way that they are in a soap. Okay, so look out for foreshadowing. Again, if I were you, I would highlight some of these structural terms, because this is your terminology. I'd be interested for you to see, if you look back at your mock papers, how many of these structural terms you actually used. So, put your hand up if you think you probably used none of them. Okay, so that's a number of you. Is that because you weren't fully aware of what structural features were? There you go. Okay, you all know language features because you've had them drummed into you from year 7. But structural features are a new thing. So this is why we're going through it. Right. Okay. What is the next most important structural feature that you should talk about? This is something that, again, with your class, Jordan, on Friday, I said was really important, and in the past people have made the mistake of talking about sentence types. So they'll tell me that's a complex sentence, but then they can't say anything about it. Often, as well, they'll identify the sentence incorrectly. So do not start telling me about simple sentences, complex sentences, etc., because pupils are unable to explain their effect. What should you talk about then to do with sentences? You can do if there's something really, really significant to say. Ladisha. Good. Lads at the back, you writing this down? Anyone know what else the exam board call them? They'll either call them structurally significant or something sentences. Word beginning with K. 3 letters. Key sentences. Okay? So again, this is your structural terminology that you need to use. Okay? Right. Who can define what a structurally significant sentence is? What's the definition? Think of what a volta is in poetry. Because a structurally significant sentence is very similar. Ladisha? Good. So you need to find in every text, again I don't care what the text is in the exam, you need to find a sentence where there is a turning point or a change, or where new information is revealed. Because a writer's job is to keep me in suspense. So often they will withhold information, back information until later in the text. And when they reveal that information, then the reader's frustration disappears because they find out what they want to know. I'll use an example for this. It depends on what text your teachers looked at with you. I'll go back to the Whitstable oysters one. Put your hand up if your teachers did the text about Whitstable oysters. I know I did. Most of you, okay. Well, sorry for those of you that haven't. In the Whitstable oysters text, do you all remember that the paragraphs were quite long? It started off, didn't it, describing the setting of Whitstable. Then it zoomed into the mother and father. Then it zoomed into the sister, Alice. And then there was one sentence, do you remember it, after all of that, that said, that was me. Remember that? Yeah? So do you see that that is a structurally significant sentence? Because only at that point can we picture the girl. Do we know who the protagonist is, who the narrator is? So new information is revealed. We now know who the story is going to be focused on. So look out for your structurally significant or key sentences. Right, after this point, there are a range of structural features that you can talk about. I know that Rakib's already said paragraph length. However, probably one of the ones, if you're going for the higher levels, that the exam board want you to look for next is this. Juxtaposition of ideas in the text or the extract. Now, that doesn't help unless you know what juxtaposition means. So what does it mean, Rakib?
Two opposite ideas.
Good. So it is the setting up of contrasts in a text. It is not an oxymoron. An oxymoron is a language feature where you have two words next to each other that are opposites. Juxtaposition can be where you have, for example, in another text that I've looked at revision, there is a young girl who talks about her relationship with her mother in the second paragraph, and that relationship is presented really negatively. And then in the sixth paragraph, she talks about her relationship with her father, and that relationship is presented very positively. So you would talk about how the two relationships are juxtaposed. So at the beginning you've got the negative, at the end you've got the positive. So look out for that, it's a higher level structural feature. So again, just highlight your structural term, juxtaposition. I am going to get paragraphing on there in a minute, but does anyone know any other structural features? But these are definitely the order that you should do them in. But what are the other structural features? One that begins with M, which means that an idea or an image recurs throughout a text. It keeps cropping up. Jordan? Motif. Good. So that is a recurring image or idea in a text. So your structural terminology is motif. Okay, let's get on there then, the paragraphing. So that can be paragraph lengths in particular, but only say something about them if there's something significant to say, if the paragraph lengths are significantly different. Otherwise, it's just a token comment. So, paragraph lengths. When you're looking at paragraphs, often paragraphs get shorter when there is a certain technique used that begins with D. So you'll have lots of description at the beginning, and then later in a text, the paragraphs might get shorter when a certain technique or method is used. What would that be? Second letter is I, so it's D-I. Anyone there? Okay, it's dialogue. So look out for sections of dialogue, speech. We'll talk tomorrow about the effect of dialogue, but generally, dialogue takes the reader into the action. It reveals more about characters' relationships with each other, and it involves them in the moment. Okay, so again, structural terminology would be paragraph lengths and dialogue. Okay, right, there's one more main structural feature, but it is ranked quite low on the list of priorities, and you've only got 10 minutes, so as long as you talk about these three, you can still get a full mark answer if it's good quality. But what is the final thing that you can talk about? If you look at words like I and my, or he and she, what's that called, Rakib?
Narrative.
Yes, go on. Good. So you can look at narrative perspective. So you would look at whether something is first or third person. So does it use I, which is first person, or does it use he, she, or a name like Jack or Sarah? We'll talk about effect of that again tomorrow, but generally, first-person narrators give you an insight into the character's internal thoughts, whereas third-person narrators means that the reader doesn't engage as much with the narrator. Okay, so we've got our structural features. What we're going to do tomorrow, we're going to look at some top tips as to how you identify quotations. And we're going to start to talk about these features and how they would interest the reader in the text that we've been studying. Okay? Right, thank you.